The road south of Patterborn was not really a road. It was a farm track sunk between banks, fruit trees along one side, a plowed field falling away on the other. An American armored column had been grinding up it since before first light. Now the column was in pieces. The lead tank was burning. Small arms fire came off both banks. And behind the American vehicles, closing from the rear, came the shapes of German tanks with twin exhaust stacks at the back, which is how the crews finally worked out they were not looking at Pershings. The three men rode in one of the jeeps. The driver was a technician 5th grade named Glenn Shantz, and back sat a major named Robert Bellinger, an aide. The man in front was a 2-star general in a pressed collar and polished boots, because he thought a division commander owed his soldiers the courtesy of looking like one, even on a morning like this. Shantz tried to squeeze past a Tiger. The gap closed. The jeep wedged between the tank's hull and a plum tree and stopped there. The hatch came open. A German soldier rose out of the turret with a machine pistol and started shouting, and nobody in the jeep spoke enough German to know what he was shouting. Bellinger unbuckled his pistol belt and let it fall. Shantz did the same. The general's hand moved to his own belt. What happened in the next second and a half is the reason you are here, and it is the one part of this story that 80 years of investigation has never closed. The German fired. 14 rounds by the count in the file. At least 2 struck the general in the head. He went forward out of the seat, and he was gone before the burst finished. Bellinger and Shantz dropped flat, crawled under the tank's belly, made a ditch, and lay in the woods until morning. Then they walked back into American lines and reported that the commander of the 3rd Armored Division was dead in a field near a village called Hamborn. The date was March 30th, 1945. Good Friday, 39 days before the German surrender. His name was Maurice Rose. He was 45 years old. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater in the whole of World War II, and the 3rd and youngest of only 3 American division commanders killed by enemy fire anywhere in that war. Within days, the Germans still trapped behind him would be sealed into a pocket that the United States Army officially renamed the Rose Pocket, which makes him the only American general of that war with a battle named after him. And if you cannot picture his face, that is not a gap in your reading. It is a gap in the record. The men who wrote the histories of that army were, overwhelmingly, the men who lived to write them. Rose did not. He left no memoir, no press campaign, no cultivated correspondent, no rehabilitation tour. He left an after-action trail and a casualty list, and those do not sell books. So let me take you back and build this properly, because the arc from a Denver high school dropout to a plowed field outside Patterborn is not a tragedy that happened to a man. It is a set of decisions made by an institution with a bill attached. 2 things in the story are genuinely unresolved, and I'm going to name both rather than paper over either. The first is what his right hand was doing in the last second of his life, which 2 separate investigations and 1 full-length biography have failed to settle. The second is how far his division actually went on the single most extraordinary day of driving any American armored formation managed in Europe, because the official history and the division's own records are off by a factor of 2 and nobody has reconciled them. Everything else here is on paper, and there's a great deal of it. To understand how a major general ended up alone on a farm track with a driver and an aide and no escort worth the name, you have to start with a 17-year-old who lied to get in. He was born in Middletown, Connecticut on November 26, 1899. His father was a rabbi. The family name had been Rouse before it was Rose. The family moved to Denver in 1902, chasing clean air for a father with tuberculosis. And the father, who arrived as an immigrant rabbi, ended up working as a dress designer and then as a Denver police officer, which is its own small American story. Rose grew up in the shadow of the National Jewish Hospital, in a house where Hebrew was read and Yiddish was spoken and a bar mitzvah was not optional. Hold that household in your head, because 80 years later, it is the single most argued over fact about him. And he spent his entire adult career keeping it off his paperwork. In 1916, he walked out of East High School and into the Colorado National Guard as a private, having lied about his age, hoping to ride into Mexico after Pancho Villa. The Army found out and discharged him after 6 weeks. That is the first fact worth holding on to. His military career opens with him being thrown out for wanting in too badly. He came back in 1917, this time with his parents' signatures, and he lied about his age again in the other direction, claiming an 1895 birth year so he would clear the minimum for officer training. It worked. He went through the first officers' training camp at Fort Riley, Kansas, and took a reserve commission as a 2nd lieutenant of infantry in August 1917, 18 years old, and a platoon in the 353rd Infantry Regiment, 89th Division. Here's the thing about that commission. There was no ring on his finger. No West Point, no Virginia Military Institute, no Citadel. He was a rabbi's son from Denver who came up through a wartime officer factory. And in the American Army of the 1920s and 30s, that fact followed a man his entire life, quietly, the way a credit rating follows you. The 89th Division went into the line near Toul in August 1918. In September, in the Sami Yel offensive, a German barrage put shrapnel into Rose and concussed him. He refused evacuation, kept going until his body quit and collapsed. The Army then made a clerical error of the kind that used to end families. It notified his parents in Denver that their son had been killed. He was in a hospital. He left it against medical advice and was back with the regiment before the armistice on November 11th, 1918. Read that sequence again. Wounded, concussed, refused evacuation, collapsed, reported dead, walked out of the hospital early. Every element of the morning outside Patterborn is already present in September 1918. The man did not change. Only the size of his command did. Then came the wilderness, and it lasted 21 years. He was discharged in June 1919 and sold mining equipment in Denver for a year, which is the least likely line on any general's record. He came back on July 1st, 1920, as a second lieutenant, was a first lieutenant the next day, and a captain the day after that, which tells you exactly how fast the post-war army was collapsing and how badly it needed anyone competent to hold a slot. And then nothing. Fort Douglas, Utah, where he passed through 4 different infantry regiments and did adjutant work and helped run the citizens' military training camps, which was the closest thing the 1920s Army had to a mission. Reserve officer training at Kansas State in 1927, where he coached the rifle teams, both the men's and the women's, the 8th Cavalry at Fort Bliss in 1931 and 32, and a summer instructing at a New Mexico National Guard encampment, adjutant at Corozal in the Panama Canal Zone from February 1933, the 6th Cavalry at Fort Oglethorpe from August 1935, 2 years as an observer and advisor to the Pennsylvania National Guard, an instructorship at the 3rd Corps Area Command and Staff School at Fort Meade in 1939. He made major in 1936, 16 years after making captain. 16 years. That is the interwar Army, and it is worth saying plainly that it ground down better connected men than Rose, and that the Army of the 1920s was not withholding advancement from him personally. There was nothing to advance into. But he did the one thing the system did reward, consistently for 2 decades. He collected schools, Infantry Company Officer Course in 1926, Cavalry Officer Course in 1931, Command and General Staff College in 1937, Army Industrial College in 1940. That last one matters more than it looks. The Industrial College taught mobilization and procurement, which is to say, it taught how the country would actually build an army out of factories. A man who had sat through both Leavenworth and the Industrial College by 1940 had thought seriously about mass and movement at a moment when very few American officers had. And then, in July 1940, the Army created the Armored Force, and everything changed for him at once, for a reason that has more to do with institutional accident than with merit. A brand new branch has no incumbents. There is no established seniority list, no 30-year-old network of graduates who came up together, no ring holders already sitting in the good jobs, because the good jobs did not exist 18 months earlier. Armor, in 1940, was the one place in the American Army where a 40-year-old major with no academy behind him and a lot of paper qualifications could get in on the ground floor and be judged on whether the tanks moved. Rose got to Fort Knox in July 1940 and took the 3rd Battalion, 13th Armored Regiment, as a lieutenant colonel. A year later, he was executive officer of the 1st Armored Brigade in the 1st Armored Division. In early 1942, he became Chief of Staff of the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels at Fort Benning, under Major General Ernest Harmon. That is where the war actually starts for him, and it is worth explaining why, because the job sounds like a filing cabinet. Chief of Staff of an armored division is the officer who turns a commander's intent into march tables, fuel allocations, maintenance schedules, and radio nets. Nothing about it is glamorous. It is also the single best classroom in the Army for learning how an armored division breaks when you push it, because the Chief of Staff is the man who gets the phone call when it does. He learns, at first hand and in his own paperwork, that an armored division is not a fist. It is a plumbing system, and it fails at the joints. It fails when a bridge goes out and 400 vehicles stack up on one road. It fails when the gasoline is 30 miles behind the tanks. It fails when a tank battalion outruns the infantry that is supposed to clear the village in front of it. Every one of those failures shows up in Rose's own handwriting for 2 years before anybody hands him a division to fail with. He went to North Africa with the 2nd Armored in December 1942 and made colonel there. He was in the theater for the American Army's worst month of the war in Europe. And in May 1943, he did something no other American officer had done. The Axis position in Tunisia collapsed in the second week of May 1943. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian troops were pinned against the coast with no evacuation and orders from Berlin that forbade the obvious. On May 13th, Rose sat down and worked out the terms of an unconditional surrender with General Major Fritz Krauss, and this was not a ceremonial signature at the end of somebody else's negotiation. It was the working session. Terms, sequencing, disarmament, the handling of the prisoners. It was the first mass unconditional surrender of German troops in the war, and the officer dictating the terms was a colonel from Denver who, by the ordinary logic of the American Army, had no business being the man in that chair. Sit with that for a second. The first German mass surrender of the Second World War was taken by a divisional chief of staff. 2 Silver Stars came out of Tunisia, but that was just the beginning of the part of his career the record actually kept. He made Brigadier General on June 2nd, 1943, and got Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, which is a real command rather than a staff job, roughly a third of a division built around tanks and armored infantry. He took it into Sicily on July 10th, 1943, and pushed it through Naro and Canicattì and on into Palermo. That produced a 3rd Silver Star, then England, and then Normandy, in June 1944 with the same command, into the hedgerows through Operation Cobra, and up to the closing of the Falaise Pocket. By the summer of 1944, he had done, at brigade level, every single thing an armored division is asked to do: assault, breakout, pursuit, encirclement. And he had spent 2 years before that watching a division's plumbing burst from the inside. And then, on August 7th, 1944, the Army handed him a division that had just failed. Quick note before the next part. A book of 100 American commanders, admirals, and airmen. Same entry for all 100. Final rank, commands, operations, decorations, fate, then what the record holds against what was claimed. 716 credited photographs, all of them again in color. High Command WW2.com. Back to the Normandy hedgerows. The 3rd Armored Division had come ashore between June 23rd and July 4th, 1944, and gone into the bocage under Major General Leroy Watson. In the hedgerows, it bled and it did not move. Its corps commander was Major General J. Lawton Collins of the 7th Corps, called Lightning Joe, and Collins was not a patient man about divisions that did not move. In early August, Collins relieved Watson. Omar Bradley, who was Watson's West Point classmate, initially argued against it and then concurred. And here is the part that matters for everything that follows, so hold it. Watson was offered a stateside job that would preserve his temporary general officer rank. He turned it down, accepted a reduction all the way to colonel in order to stay in France, went to Bradley's 12th Army Group staff, and then became assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division. In November 1944, less than 3 months after being reduced, he was a brigadier general again. In 1953, he retired a major general. I want to be fair to Watson, because that is a genuinely creditable set of choices. A man who takes 2 grades off his collar to stay in the theater is not a careerist. But look at what that sequence proves about the institution. The American Army had a working mechanism for restoring a relieved general's rank inside of 90 days. It had no mechanism at all for remembering the man who was sent in to fix what he left. Rose got a 2nd star in the division on August 7th. He inherited about 16,000 men, and he inherited something else that almost nobody mentions, which I will come back to, because it is the buried scandal in this entire story. What he did with it over the next 3 weeks is the reason Collins never regretted the choice. The 3rd Armored closed the Argenton-Falaise encirclement near Putangs by August 18th, crossed the Seine on the night of August 25th, reached the Belgian border on September 2nd, and took Mons is where the arithmetic starts to tell you what kind of commander this was. The 1st Army had run from St. Lo to Paris to Mons to the German border, roughly 750 miles, in under 6 weeks, and Charles B. MacDonald writes in the Green Book, The Siegfried Line Campaign, that the Army stopped near Mons long enough to bag about 25,000 Germans in one pocket. The 3rd Armored's own share of that haul was around 8,000 prisoners, and the way it happened is worth a minute, because it is the opposite of a set-piece battle, and it is the single best illustration of what Rose's method was for. Nobody planned Mons. The 3rd Armored had been ordered northeast to cut roads, and it arrived across the retreat routes of German formations that were still walking west to east out of France, in the dark, in the rain, with no idea that an American armored division was sitting on the highway in front of them. What followed over roughly 2 days was a series of collisions in which German columns marched into American tank guns at close range, and the Americans found themselves fighting in every direction at once with no front line to orient on. That is the hardest situation there is for an armored division to control, because there is no axis of advance to push along. There is only a mess, and the only thing that decides it is how fast the man in charge can read which of his own units is about to be overrun and get weight to it. Rose ran it from inside it. For his personal conduct between September 6th and 9th, First Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross under General Orders No. 86, dated November 25th, 1944. Note the ranks in that citation. Major General, 3rd Armored Division, cited for extraordinary heroism, not for planning. 2-star generals are not supposed to earn the nation's 2nd highest decoration for valor. They are supposed to be somewhere. A citation for valor is not available to them. And then it got harder, because the pursuit ended and the West Wall started. On September 10th, the division fired what it claimed was the first American field artillery shell onto German soil. On September 12th, its elements became the first American ground unit across the German border. On September 21st, it took Stolberg and became the first American unit to capture a German town, and then set up the first American military government of one, which is an administrative footnote that nobody had written a manual for, and which a tank division's staff had to invent in a week. Now, most of you already know how the autumn of 1944 went for First Army. Aachen, the Stolberg Corridor, the Hurtgen. What is less discussed is what those months did specifically to an armored division that had been designed for open country and was now being fed into fortified villages and wet forest. Understand what the ground did to the machine. In the pursuit across France, an armored division is the most efficient formation on Earth. It moves faster than the enemy can reorganize. It fights at ranges where its own guns work, and its casualties come mostly from ambush and mines. Put that same division into the West Wall belt, and every single one of those advantages inverts. The pillboxes are sited to cover the roads the tanks have to use. The villages are stone. The fields are soaked and will not take a tracked vehicle off the road, which means the road is the only axis, which means the anti-tank gun already knows where you will be. Tanks stop being the weapon and become the support. The men who actually take the ground are the armored infantrymen, on foot, in the rain, working from house to house. So the autumn of 1944 converts the 3rd Armored Division from a formation that spends fuel into a formation that spends infantrymen. This is where the exchange rate on Rose's division went bad, and it never came back. Which brings me to the thing I said I would come back to. And I will say up front that, in my view, this is the single most important fact in the story of Maurice Rose, and it has almost nothing to do with Maurice Rose. In March 1942, the Army stood up the Armored Division on what became known as the Heavy Table of Organization. 14,620 officers and men, 2 armored regiments, 6 tank battalions between them, 390 tanks, and 1 armored infantry regiment of 3 battalions. Do the division, and you get 6.1 armored infantrymen for every tank in the division. In September 1943, the Army looked at that structure, decided it was tank heavy and infantry starved, and rebuilt it. The new light table came down to 10,937 men, 3 tank battalions instead of 6, 263 tanks instead of 390, 3 separate armored infantry battalions, and 750 more rifles and carbines than the old organization carried. The ratio went from 6.1 infantrymen per tank to 11.4. 14 of the 16 American armored divisions converted. 2 did not. The 2nd and the 3rd Armored Divisions stayed on the 1942 tables with modifications for the whole war. So think about what that means on the ground in the Stolberg Corridor in October 1944. Rose has more tanks than any other American armored division commander in Europe, and roughly half the dismounted infantry per tank that they have. And the mission he keeps getting over and over is the mission that eats dismounted infantry. Take the village, clear the pillbox, hold the shoulder, lead the corps. I believe that is the quietest and most consequential decision anyone made about Maurice Rose, and it was made a year before he took the division by a staff in Washington for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The Army kept its 2 most tank-heavy divisions on an organization it had already judged wrong, and then habitually gave those 2 divisions the point. Rose did not complain about it in any document I have found. What he did instead was invent a way to work around it, and this is the part that separates him from a merely brave officer. He fought the division as a rotating set of combined arms task forces built around named commanders, rather than around the paper regiments. Task Force Hogan under Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan, Task Force Lovelady under Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady, Task Force Wellborn, Task Force Richardson under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Richardson, Task Force Kane, Task Force X. Here is what one of those actually was, because the name makes it sound tidier than it was. Take a medium tank battalion, attach a company or two of armored infantry and half-tracks, attach a platoon of armored engineers with demolitions and a treadway bridge section, because the Germans blew every bridge behind them and a division that waits for corps engineers does not advance. Attach a company of tank destroyers, because your own tank gun cannot be relied on to kill what is coming. Attach a battery or battalion of self-propelled 105mm howitzers that can shoot from the column without unlimbering. Attach a reconnaissance troop to feel ahead. Give the whole thing one radio net and one lieutenant colonel, and cut it loose on its own road with an objective and no detailed instructions. Do that 4 or 5 times over, and you have Rose's division, and notice what it solves. The paper organization gave him 2 armored regiments and 1 armored infantry regiment, which means on paper his infantry is a single pool that any serious fight will drain. Broken into task forces, the infantry shortage is distributed across 5 columns instead of concentrated in 1, and no single regiment gets fed into the grinder for a week straight. When one task force burned out, another took the point, and the burned one went into reserve and got replacements. The division kept continuous pressure on with a structure that was not built for continuous pressure. The cost of the method is the part that killed him, and it is not complicated. A commander who runs 5 semi-independent columns on 5 different roads has no picture of his own division unless he goes and looks. The radios of 1944 are line of sight, and they are worse in forest and in towns. A task force that is in trouble reports that it is in trouble late, if at all, because the man commanding it is fighting rather than talking, and because no lieutenant colonel wants to be the one who says he has stopped. Aerial reconnaissance gives you yesterday. A situation map at a division command post 20 miles back is a record of where things were 2 hours ago. The only way to know which of 5 columns is genuinely cracking right now is to be close enough to see it, and the only place close enough is at the head of one of the columns. So Rose put his command group in a jeep and went. And the arithmetic of doing that 100 times over 231 days was never going to come out in his favor. Collins asked him about it, and this is one of the few genuinely reliable quotations we have from Rose's own mouth, because Collins reproduced the exchange in his memoir Lightning Joe, an autobiography. Rose told his corps commander, and I'm quoting, "General, there is only one way I know to lead this division, and that's at the head of it." Collins also wrote this about him. Maurice Rose was the top armored commander in the army when he was killed. Tall, handsome, always dressed immaculately, even in combat, he was a commanding figure who claimed instant respect from officers and men alike. And Collins, who had come to visit him on the Cologne plain, remembered finding the division command post in an exposed house at the very end of a small town. An exposed house at the very end of a small town. A corps commander noticed it and wrote it down 20 years later because it was not normal. Daniel Bulger, the retired lieutenant general who wrote The Panzer Killers, builds his whole account of Rose around exactly that habit and puts his finger on the thing that made it unusual. It was not that Rose was braver than his peers. It was that he had concluded, on evidence that a division organized his way could not be commanded any other way, and then accepted the consequences of his own analysis. Bulger's book also lands on the reason Rose vanished, in one clause. He did not survive to write his post-war memoirs. Here's where the winter arrives and the bill gets bigger. In mid-December 1944, when the German Ardennes offensive tore open First Army's front, the Third Armored went south into the northern shoulder of the salient. Rose's task forces held ground north of the deepest German penetration, and the Germans never got through them. The division claimed 98 German tanks destroyed in that fighting, and one of those task forces very nearly died. Task Force Hogan, about 400 men, was cut off at Marcoret in the Belgian hills, out of fuel, low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, with wounded it could not evacuate. Rose ordered Hogan by radio to destroy every vehicle and every piece of equipment and walk out. They did it quietly so the Germans would not hear the demolition, smeared grease from the tanks on their faces to kill the shine, left the medics and the worst of the wounded behind with a doctor, and infiltrated on foot by compass and stars. 14 hours. Roughly 400 men came through. That order is a good place to test whether we are doing hero worship here, so let us test it. It was the right call, and it was a brutal one. It traded every vehicle in a task force, and the men too badly hurt to walk for the 400 who could. Rose gave it in about the time it takes to read the sentence. A commander who is not forward, who is not watching the fuel state in the aid station reports himself, gives that order too late, or does not give it at all. That is the argument for the way he ran his division, and it is a strong one. Then came the winter's other lesson, which arrived on a flatbed. In February 1945, 20 of the Army's brand new T-26E3 heavy tanks, the vehicle that became the M-26 Pershing, reached Europe in a program called the Zebra Mission. 10 of them went to the 3rd Armored Division, arriving at a maintenance yard near Aachen on February 17th. 10 tanks in a division authorized well over 200 medium tanks. A rounding error with a 90mm gun on it. Rose made a specific decision about those 10, and it is a genuinely arguable one. Rather than concentrate them as a shock element, which is what most commanders would have done and what the doctrine of the day would have suggested, he had them distributed one per tank company across the 32nd and 33rd Armored Regiments, and he directed that the best available crews be put in them. He watched a gunnery demonstration himself, and afterward told Eisenhower that American gunnery was far superior to that of the Germans. I think the distribution decision was right, and here's the reasoning, because it goes to how he understood his own problem. 10 heavy tanks, concentrated, give you one hammer that can be in exactly one place. 10 heavy tanks, distributed, give every one of your columns a single vehicle that can kill a Panther from the front. In a division that fights as 5 separate task forces on 5 separate roads, the second thing is worth far more than the first, because the killing you need done is not one battle. It is one Panther, on one road, per column, once a day, forever. Now hold that against what his crews were actually facing, because this is the specific piece that a casual viewer almost never gets. And it is the reason the 3rd Armored's loss column looks the way it does. The standard M4 Sherman in his division carried a short 75mm gun. Against the frontal armor of a Panther, at the ranges you actually meet a Panther in Western Germany, that gun could not be relied on to penetrate at all. Not sometimes, not at reduced odds. The crews knew it. The German long 75 on the Panther and the 88 on the Tiger could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's return fire was, in practical terms, noise, which meant that American tank crews won those engagements by maneuver and numbers rather than by gunnery. And maneuver and numbers is a euphemism. It means the first tank in the column absorbs the shot so that the second and third can get onto the flank. It means somebody in every column is the bait, every day, and the crews knew which position in the order of march that was. Now the numbers. Rose's division wrote off 633 of its own medium tanks destroyed over the campaign, which is the highest figure in the American armored force. Its maintenance battalion recovered and returned another 1,305 medium tanks to the line. Read those two figures together, because separately they mean nothing, and together they are the whole story. The 3rd Armored Division did not so much operate tanks as consume and regenerate them continuously, and the reason it could keep going at all was a maintenance battalion that repaired 6,324 vehicles of all types over the campaign. That battalion is the least celebrated unit in this entire account, and it is the one that made every record in it possible. On March 5th and 6th, 1945, the division took Cologne, the first American armor, into a major German city. One of those 10 Pershings did the thing everybody remembers, killing a Panther in the open near the cathedral at about 1300 hours on the 6th, with 3 armor-piercing rounds, in front of a Signal Corps cameraman, which is why that particular 90 seconds of the war is on film and the rest of the division's 14 months is not. That, by itself, is a decent short lesson in how military reputations get made. But that was the end of the grinding phase. What came next broke the record books and killed him. On March 25th, 1945, 1st Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead, and Collins put the 3rd Armored at the front of 7th Corps with orders to run. MacDonald's Green Book. The last offensive tracks it day by day, and the numbers are worth hearing in sequence. March 25th, before daylight, the division attacked east toward Altenkirchen through the lines of the 104th Infantry Division, and by midday stood 12 miles beyond its line of departure. March 26th, past Altenkirchen, high ground outside Hockenberg, coiled for the night halfway to the Dill. March 27th, 22 miles, and across the Dill River in 2 places. March 28th, another 21 miles, into Marburg, overrunning German hospitals and taking another 10,000 prisoners. Then Collins turned the division 90 degrees north toward Patterborn to close the top of the Ruhr encirclement. And this is where the record gets contested. MacDonald writes that Task Force Richardson, built around a medium tank battalion that included 3 of the new Pershings, got a verbal order on March 29th that consisted of 4 words: just go like hell. MacDonald says the task force covered 45 miles that day and halted 15 miles short of Paderborn around midnight. The division's own account is very different. The 3rd Armored's history and the Division Association put the division's gain on March 29th at over 90 miles. The Margrethen Memorial dossier on Rose gives 150 kilometers, which is about 93 miles. And the Jewish War Veterans of the United States calls it the longest one-day advance through enemy territory by any Allied division in the war at more than 100 miles. So, which is it? My reading is that both figures are probably honest, and they are measuring different things. MacDonald is tracking one task force's forward progress along its axis. The division is almost certainly counting road miles run by its columns, which, on a day when 4 task forces are looping around blown bridges and detouring through farm lanes, will always exceed the map distance gained, sometimes by a factor of 2. I have not seen a document that reconciles them, and I am not going to pretend I have. What I will say is this: the conservative figure, the official history's 45 miles in a day against contact, would still be one of the fastest single-day advances any American division made in Europe. And the 4-day run from March 27th through March 30th is documented in the Green Book at 22, 21, and 45 miles before the shooting started. Anyone who needs the 100-mile version to be impressed is not paying attention, because here is what the speed actually cost, and it arrived on the 4th morning. Paderborn was not an empty objective. It was the German Army's own armor school, the Westphalian equivalent of Fort Knox, and it had been that for years. When 7th Corps came at it, the SS scraped together everything on the training establishment into a formation called SS Ersatzbrigade Westfalen, an SS Panzer Reconnaissance Training Battalion, an SS Tank Training and Replacement Regiment, an SS Tank Replacement Battalion with roughly 60 Tiger and Panther tanks, elements of the 507th Heavy Panzer Battalion in the fight alongside them, instructors, cadre, and half-trained replacements, sitting on their own gunnery ranges in heavy tanks, on ground. Every one of them had walked and mapped and fired over in training. That combination is worse than it sounds, and better than it sounds at the same time, which is why the fighting there was so strange. The crews were green, some of them very green, and they handled their tanks badly in the open. But the instructors were not green at all. The tanks were the best tanks on the battlefield, and nobody needed a map. A tank gunnery instructor defending his own range knows every firing position, every dead space, and the exact range to every hedge line, because he's been teaching those numbers to students for 2 years, and the terrain gave them everything. This is farm country broken up by wooded ridges, sunken lanes, and small villages a few hundred yards apart, ground where a tank can sit still, cover one road, and be invisible to everything not on it. That is what a division running 90 degrees off its own axis, after 4 days of the hardest driving it had ever done, with its fuel trucks strung up behind it, drove into at first light on Good Friday morning. And Rose was where he always was. Forward, in an unarmored quarter-ton truck with a driver, an aide, his division artillery commander, Colonel Frederick Brown, in a second jeep, and his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Sweat, in an armored car behind, moving up behind Task Force Wellborn's lead elements to find out why his columns had stalled and whether his forward units were cut off. Small arms fire, then tank and anti-tank fire from both flanks. The lead tank went up. Rose, Bellinger, and Schantz went into a ditch. German tanks closed from behind them, which meant the party was now inside the German position rather than in front of it. They took to a field, tried to get back onto the road ahead of the German armor, and Brown's jeep made it past. Rose's did not. You already know the last part. Now let me deal with the dispute honestly, because this is the reason most people who know Rose's name know it at all, and because it has been used badly in both directions for 80 years. The claim is that Maurice Rose was murdered, that he was disarming himself in the act of surrender in front of a German tank commander who could see 3 unarmed men, and that he was shot anyway, and that some accounts add the suggestion that the German knew he was shooting a Jew. Here is the case for it, and it is not a weak case. 2 men were standing next to him. Bellinger and Schantz both had their pistol belts on the ground, and neither of them was fired on. The general's hand went to the same buckle. That is a very hard fact to explain away. The Colorado Encyclopedia states the surrender version flatly, saying the 3 men raised their hands as a clear sign of surrender, and that Rose was shot to death anyway. American newspapers carried it in April 1945 as a killing, and inside the 3rd Armored Division, the belief that their commander had been murdered was close to universal, which is exactly what you would expect, and also exactly why it is not evidence. And here's the other side of it, which is where the documents actually are. The Army investigated it as a possible war crime. The investigation was led by Colonel Leon Jaworski, the same prosecutor, who would later run the Watergate Special Prosecution, and it found no war crime. Its reasoning turned on physical evidence rather than testimony. Rose's body was left in the Jeep. So were his maps. So were his code materials. A German crew that had knowingly killed an American division commander does not leave the body and the signals material sitting in the vehicle unsearched and drive away. Jaworski's conclusion was that the crew almost certainly did not know what they had done, and that the killing was, in his phrasing, a combination of unfortunate circumstances. MacDonald, writing the official history in the last offensive, refuses to resolve it, and I think his sentence is the most honest one anybody has written on this. Standing in front of the tank, Bellinger and Schantz unbuckled their pistol belts and let them drop. Rose started either to do the same or to remove his pistol from its holster. The German in the turret quickly swung his burp gun, and a spout of flame split the darkness. Rose pitched forward, either to do the same or to remove his pistol. That is a professional historian declining to invent a fact. Paul Leopold, writing for the 3rd Armored Division Association, went through the account and landed in the same place, and his phrasing is blunter. Panic, confusion, fatigue, and inexperience probably suffice to explain the jerking of the trigger finger. That verdict is worth weighing precisely because of where it comes from. The division's own veterans organization, the most natural home in the world for a murder theory, concluded there probably was not one. Stephen Ossad and Don Marsh, whose Major General Maurice Rose, World War II's greatest forgotten commander, is the standard biography, pried the sealed investigation files loose through 2 members of Congress, worked through the field investigators' reports and the witness affidavits, and produced what reviewers fairly called the last chapter of the investigation, rather than a murder verdict. So here's my view, and I will flag it as mine because other historians land differently. I think the untouched map case is the single strongest fact on the table, and it points hard away from a targeted killing. I think the man in that turret was a tanker in a collapsing country, at the head of a column that had just been shot at from both sides, looking down at an officer whose hand was on a weapon belt. And I think he fired because that is what frightened men in turrets do. But I also think we should be precise about what the finding was, because 2 things get quietly merged. Jaworski found no prosecutable war crime. That is not the same finding as no wrongful killing. 3 men with their hands going down are not a threat, and 14 rounds is not a warning burst. And the honest end of it is that the only question that matters, what Rose's right hand was actually doing, could not be answered then and cannot be answered now, because the 2 men who were closest to it were looking at the machine pistol, not at him. The dispute is not going to close. What I object to is either side pretending it has. The consequences did not wait. Brigadier General Doyle Hickey, the assistant division commander, took over the same day and kept the division moving, which is the highest compliment available to a staff. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, at about 1300 hours, a task force of the 3rd Armored met one from the 2nd Armored Division on the eastern fringe of Lippstadt, and the ring closed. What was inside it was the largest encirclement of German forces in the Western War, 30 miles by 75 miles. Army Group B headquarters, the entire 5th Panzer Army, most of the 15th Army, 2 corps of the 1st Parachute Army, 7 corps, and 19 divisions. American intelligence had estimated something like 150,000 men inside, and MacDonald notes that estimate proved far too conservative. When it finally collapsed in the middle of April, 317,000 Germans came out of it as prisoners, along with 26 generals and an admiral. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who commanded it, shot himself in the woods outside Duisburg on April 21st. 12 days after Rose's death, on April 11th, the same division rolled into Nordhausen and found the Dora Mittelbau camp and the Bülke Kaserne subcamp, with over 1,000 corpses lying in the open and a few hundred living prisoners, of whom about 250 were moved to hospitals with help from the 104th Infantry Division. Rose never saw it. His division's own record of what it was fighting was completed without him, and then the Army renamed the pocket. The Ruhr Pocket became the Rose Pocket, which sounds like the record correcting itself, and I want to argue that it is closer to the opposite, because look at what happened to the actual name. He was buried under a Latin cross because the Army's own record said Protestant. That is not a clerical error. Rose had put Protestant on his official papers himself, and he listed several denominations of Christianity across various hospital records over the years, and Assad and Marsh conclude that he was simply not observant as an adult rather than that he ever converted. The collector Marshal Fogel has noted that Rose carried no J on his dog tags. In mid-1945, the marker at his grave was changed to a Star of David. Then Rabbi Lefkowitz objected, in part because he thought the man's own stated wishes should govern, and in part because the general's Jewish identity was by then being used to raise money for a Denver hospital. By November 1945, the marker was a cross again. He was moved to his permanent grave at the Netherlands American Cemetery at Margraten in 1949. He is under a cross there today. Now, about the claim you have probably heard attached to his name that he was the ranking American Jewish officer to die in the European theater. I wanted that one specifically, and here is what survives. As a matter of rank it holds, and it holds comfortably. No American officer of higher rank and Jewish birth was killed in action in any theater of that war. Assad and Marsh go further and call him the most senior Jewish American ever killed in battle in any of this country's wars. And as far as I can establish, that is also accurate. What does not survive is the tidy version, and the tidy version is the one that gets repeated. The man himself never made that claim, never used it, and wrote the word Protestant on his own paperwork in an army where a rabbi's son from Denver had a realistic reading of what a J did to a promotion file. His biographers do not present him as a Jewish general. They present him as a man who put his origins away in order to work, and who is now claimed by everyone who wants him, including a hospital, a memorial fund, and more than one heritage organization, and he is not available to referee it. I think that gap is the most human thing in this entire story, and I think it also tells you something ugly about the environment he was working in. Here is the other thing you should know before the numbers, because it goes to how thin the record on him really is. The 3rd Armored Division Association's own statistics page has Rose killed on March 31st. Wikipedia's division article says March 31st. Nearly every other source, including MacDonald's Green Book and the War Crimes file, says March 30th. The man has a battle named after him, and the institutions that keep his memory cannot agree on the day. That is not the audience's failure. That is what happens when a commander leaves no memoir and no advocate. The numbers tell the rest of it. 231 days in combat, 76,720 German prisoners taken between June 29th, 1944, and May 8th, 1945. 6,751 German combat vehicles destroyed, captured, or abandoned to them, including 1,794 tanks. On its own side of the ledger, 147 light tanks gone on top of the mediums, and 1,832 vehicles of all types written off for good. Casualties, and this is where you have to be careful, because there are 3 official versions, and they disagree. The division's own G3 in August 1945 reported 2,214 killed, 7,451 wounded, and 10,371 total battle casualties. The European Theater History section in December 1945 reported 2,540 killed, 7,331 wounded, 10,105 battle casualties, and with non-battle losses added, 16,122 total, which is 111.5% of the division's authorized strength. The statistical branch's 1953 accounting, the one you will see cited most often, gives 9,243. Purple Hearts awarded in excess of 10,500, 17 Distinguished Service Crosses, 885 Silver Stars. By the division's own reckoning, it took the most total casualties of any Allied armored division of the war, and its figures exceeded those of every American airborne division except the 101st. Now the comparison that actually indicts something, and I want a named peer for it rather than an average. Take the 2nd Armored Division. The Army's only other heavy division on the same 1942 tables Rose's division was on, the division where Rose himself had been Chief of Staff, commanded in the last stretch of the war by Major General Ernest Harmon and then Major General Isaac White. It captured 76,963 Germans. Set that against the 3rd Armored's total, and the two are within 0.25% of each other. Now, the other column. On every published accounting I have been able to check, and they do differ from each other. The 3rd Armored's dead run close to double the 2nd Armored's. Same organization, same theater, same war. Nearly identical output in prisoners, roughly twice the dead. I want to be careful with that, because it is the kind of statistic that gets weaponized. It is not proof that Rose was careless with his men, and anybody who reaches for that reading is skipping the mission assignments. The 3rd Armored was 1st Army's habitual point division, first across the border, first into a German town, first into Cologne, the northern shoulder in the Ardennes, the spearhead to Paderborn. Somebody has to be at the front of a corps, and if it is you, every single time, your casualty column will not look like anybody else's, no matter how you fight. But I do not think you get to leave it entirely there either, and this is my honest verdict on the man rather than on the system. Rose's method, task forces pushed continuously with the commander far enough forward to see which one was cracking, produced results that no other American armored division matched. It also spent men faster, and it eventually spent him at a moment when his division was 4 days into the fastest running it had ever done, and the ground ahead of it was an armor school. In my view, Collins was exactly right that Rose was the best armored commander in the Army, and exactly wrong to keep noticing that command post at the end of the exposed street and do nothing about it. A corps commander who writes down that a division commander is too far forward, 20 years later, in a memoir, had the authority to say so at the time. And there is one more number in this, which is the one the Army never had to put in a table. The 3rd Armored Division fought from June 1944 to May 1945, and it never got a 4th star for anyone, never got its commander a corps, and never got the man who ran it a place in the popular memory of that war. On his corps, commander's own written judgment, he was the best in the Army at what he did. He held his 2nd star for 7 months and 23 days, and he never held a 3rd. Here's where this stops being about one man, so let me name the pattern rather than the person. The American Army in World War II had a promotion and reputation system that ran on 3 things: visibility, longevity, and sponsorship. A commander who was seen by correspondents, who survived to file his own version, and who had a patron in the hierarchy, ended the war famous and often ended it with a corps or an army. Rose had none of the 3. He was intensely private and never courted a reporter. He was killed with barely 5 weeks of the war left to run, so he never filed his version of any of it. And he had come up through an officer training camp in 1917, rather than through West Point, in an army where the ring was a network and the network was how you got sponsored. None of that is a conspiracy. That is what makes it worth talking about. Nobody suppressed Maurice Rose. A system with those 3 inputs simply produces this output reliably every time, and it will produce it again in any institution built the same way. And, if that sounds familiar, if you have watched the most dependable unit in an organization get handed every emergency precisely because it can be counted on, and then watch the reward for that dependability turn out to be more emergencies, you are not imagining a pattern. It is older than any of us. The structural piece is the part I would put in front of a war college class. 14 of 16 American armored divisions were reorganized in September 1943 because the Army had concluded the old table had too few infantrymen per tank. 2 divisions were left on the old table. Those same 2 divisions were then used repeatedly for the missions that consumed infantry. The Army did not fail to identify the problem. It identified it, wrote a new table, applied the new table to 14 divisions, and then kept giving the point to the 2 it had exempted. In my view, that is not an oversight. That is an institution choosing convenience over its own analysis, and then paying for it in other people's sons. The dispute over how he died has swallowed almost all the oxygen around his name, and I think that is the last injustice in this story. Whether that German fired out of malice or out of panic changes exactly one thing: the moral weight of one man in one turret in 1 second of a war that had 39 days left in it. It changes nothing about the 14 months in front of it. A division that took every one of those firsts, held the shoulder in the Ardennes and did not break, ran 4 days from the Rhine to the armor school, and closed a ring on 317,000 men. That record does not depend on how its commander's last second is adjudicated, and we have let it depend on exactly that, because the last second is the part that makes a good story. He was under a cross, then a Star of David, then a cross again, in a country he had liberated, in a cemetery his division helped make possible. The Army named the biggest bag of prisoners in the Western War after him, and then let his own Veterans Association get the date of his death wrong. His division carried the highest casualty bill of any Allied armored division of the war, and the organization chart that helped produce that bill had been declared obsolete a year before he ever took command of it. Maurice Rose spent 21 years as a nobody in a peacetime army, took the first mass German surrender of the war as a colonel who was not supposed to be in the room, fixed a division that had failed, and then led it from the front every day he had until the front reached back and took him. He asked for one thing from the institution he served, which was to be allowed to lead at the head of his division. It gave him that and almost nothing else, and it is still arguing about the second and a half in which it stopped. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.